And online, and to our later viewers, to this meeting on trade unionism and working class organisation. A topic that never goes away, but has particular resonance right now, when a year of trade union struggles seem to be ending in a ditch of extremely poor settlements, disgruntled memberships, leaderships who are selling defeats as victories, and it all being rounded up into a, well, let's put our faith in electing Labour at the next election to save the position of the working class, which in the meantime is sinking very fast and by the day. But the point that I feel needs underlining is that it has for a long time seemed to me that there's a kind of a parallel world in the French working class between those who are well unionised with good rights, who are very militant in defence of those rights, and you see wonderful struggles, but there's a whole section of the French working class population, almost an underclass, not represented in those struggles, not represented in those unions, not taking part, who don't have the same rights to defend. And Victoire has explained that to us, in fact, very well in the last part of her speech, that that's exactly the section of the working class that her work is aimed at reaching, and that her work is aimed in the CGT is aimed at drawing into the structures of the union, and that this is a deficiency, that I was right when I looked at the French working class and said, something funny happening. And you know, the sort of parallel worlds we see of the very militant, organised, you know, in defence of their rights, and then this sort of very almost separate underclass of the banlieues, mainly migrants, very, very often young, police repression, racism, you know, and this sort of slightly parallel universe that we see in France, and we see in many countries, in fact, and we also see it in our own country. I remember working in the trade unions in Britain and trying to talk to union leaderships about the fact that there's a huge immigrant workforce in Britain and we are doing nothing to bring them into our structures. Another point I think is really important from Victoire's speech I wanted to just underline was this constant pressure on Marxists who are active in the trade union movement on international issues. Internationalism is anathema to an imperialist ruling class, and they do absolutely everything they can to separate trade union consciousness from real proletarian internationalist consciousness, from an understanding of workers in the imperialist heartlands, that their struggle and their conditions of life have a connection to the situation of workers abroad, that they, when they fight for their rights in terms of pensions and pay, should understand its connection to the suppression of workers abroad. And the pressure that comes on those who try to bring a real understanding of imperialism into the trade union movement is unrelenting and has to date been very effective. In France and in Britain, we see the results of that supremacist ideology is rife in the trade union movement, chauvinism, a general sense of superiority, and that the foreigners are something separate to us, and the war is something separate, and a willingness to go along with ruling class jingoism on the question of the drive to war. And the third point is really the first point, which is the whole experience that Victoire related to us, and that we've seen, you know, from the limited contact we've had and reports we've had from France, but has been fleshed out really helpfully for us from Victoire's speech, is that when the masses are moving, the masses can learn. Mm-hmm. And the job of communists is to be there, helping them to learn their lessons accurately and quickly. But the longer the people can be kept moving, acting, working, the more open they are to learning the lessons, the more opportunities there are for them to learn, and the more open they are to the people who can help them to learn those lessons. And Victoire's given us some really great examples of direct action being taken by workers. And what is the major role? If you're a communist, What's the major role of trade union work? We call them a school of communism. Why? Because you learn to be a communist there? No. Because you learn that the working class has power. You learn it not just theoretically, but concretely. You learn to use it, you learn to feel it, you learn to exercise it. You know, when Victoire gave us this example of energy workers going out and turning back on, reconnecting customers who their bosses had disconnected. This is not charity. This is workers using their power. Totally different thing. This is why we call the trade unions a school for communism. Because it's the lesson the workers need in order to prepare them to make revolutionary struggle. They have to have the consciousness and the belief in their ability. And that's what the ruling class tries so hard to take from us, and what this type of struggle infuses into the workers. So what we see, comrades, as we come into this period of intensifying struggle, is that the ruling class in Britain has really achieved for itself a very strong, institutionally embedded machinery of control of the working class. It's very effective. I've seen how it works on many, many levels, and how professional are the gatekeepers of the trade union movement in controlling what they constantly call democracy, and what is actually a total perversion of working class democracy. And the other point that comes out to me again that I think needs underlining, and that's why I keep interrupting, sorry, comrades, the dangers of the professionalisation of working class organisation. Whether it's our political parties or our trade unions, very often we end up with the same result. We have good revolutionaries, good class fighters turned into bureaucrats, and machines who develop their own logic. And the logic is to maintain the machine. It stops being the logic of beating the enemy, the logic of winning the class war, the logic of arriving at socialism, making the revolution. It's the object is just to keep this machine going that we've built and we're so proud of. And look how far we've come. We've got this machine. We must keep the machine. But the machine is part of the status quo. So what they actually have is a vested interest in maintaining the status quo and their position within the status quo as permanent oppositionists.
Yeah.
Respected, recognised, paid, professional. It's a status quo position. And it's the opposite of what these organisations were founded for. But this is very much inherent in creating a paid workforce for the working class struggle in conditions of capitalism. And something I think we should pay attention to and think about as our struggle heats up once again, and we think about how do we create structures that can maintain militancy and actually keep leaders who will guide the struggle in a way that's aimed at winning and not simply at maintaining a position of leadership. So, comrades, just in wrapping up the meeting, I want to come back to a few key points. And I think the first thing we have to keep bringing ourselves back to, and it's come out of this discussion several times, is why do our struggles always seem to fail? And there are certain key elements to the answer to that. One of them has been highlighted in this meeting several times. It's the link to the Labour Party and the absolute control that the parliamentary Labour Party has over the entire mechanism of the TUC, the rest of the Labour Party, the union leaderships, and down through all the union committees. And, you know, all of us who've sat on union committees or tried to get jobs as union workers can tell stories about how your career as a unionist will prosper or fail depending on your affiliation to the Labour Party. That's number one. Number two is, again, this absolute civility before the law and this constant using of the law, a legal environment that has been specifically created to make sure that a strike cannot be effective within its terms. Right? That's an environment that's been precisely designed in this country. And we've watched it be instituted over the last 4 decades. Right? And it's made it, as Alex said, it's made it so that, according to the law, the only people allowed to be in dispute are those directly affected, and the way that is determined, again, it's sort of up to the ruling class to tell you who's affected, and the trade union bureaucracy has become the lieutenants of the ruling class, telling us who's affected and who isn't, not allowing members of the same union to communicate with one another or to support one another. What on earth is the point of Unite telling you it's Britain's biggest union? But when you go on a dispute with Unite, you're not even allowed to tell the people in a branch next door about your dispute. It's not their dispute, it's your dispute. Never mind mobilize them, never mind, actually call on the power of you. Imagine if some nurses in dispute or some cleaners in dispute somewhere were unionized by Unite, and Unite took the advice of, or followed the example of the unionists Ranjit was telling us about in the Clydeside in 1918, 1919, who would have pulled out the whole of the Clydeside to pull those employers onto the negotiating table like that. Imagine if some cleaners in a school organised by Unite went to leadership and said, they're treating us like dirt and they won't talk to us, and Unite said, right, the union's coming out. Well, then it would be worth something, wouldn't it, to be in Britain's biggest union? What does it mean to workers today to be in Britain's biggest union? Britain's best bureaucracy for ignoring the strikes of its poor members who just pay their dues for absolutely nothing. And of course, what we talked about was also the institutionalised bureaucracies. I highlighted the point earlier, but they're trained in enforcing these things. They're trained in enforcing the labour link. They're trained in enforcing civility before the law. They're well rewarded for carrying out their training. It's very timely that our party is producing a small pamphlet on social democracy. About 2 minutes. Okay. And we have to notice that even in France, we continue to fight the same battles. Right. So one of the jobs of communists is not only to help trade unionists to fight effectively, but to teach them that the trade union struggle, even waged in the most effective way, it cannot be the end of our story. So just briefly, I want to remind everybody, we have brought out this pamphlet, the Manifesto for the Crisis. This is our party's contribution to what's happening. If you look through the contents of this, it tells you exactly what we want to say to people. Number one, what's the problem with the system? Why are we in this crisis? Number two, where did inflation come from? What does it mean, this cost of living crisis? Number three, what's happening to the workers in the course of this struggle? Number four, how is it connected to the drive to war? We've not talked about that today, but it's a very essential point to understand for the working class. And number five, what would a real fight back actually look like? And we have model motions on all these most fundamental questions. A model motion on breaking the link with Labour, a model motion on defying the anti-union laws and not being servile to them, a model motion on the measures needed right now today to help workers survive in the face of the most brutal attack on their working conditions and their standard of living, their pay and everything that's happening to them, and a model motion on refusing to cooperate any longer with the imperialist war drive.